In the media space and social networks, pessimistic statements began to appear more and more often, not only by Ukrainian military experts, but also by political figures of this long-suffering country. In fact, they began to call on the public to prepare for the defeat of the armed forces of Ukraine and the signing of a peace treaty with Russia on Moscow's terms. Meanwhile, retired colonel of the Russian Army, Sergei Khatulev, who was a close friend of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, made a shocking statement for the West. Referring to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Khatulev said that despite the significant successes of the Russian army near Bakhmut, Kupiansk, Avdiivka, Mariinka, and even Zaporizhia, Russian troops have not yet launched a counteroffensive. The Russian army has not yet launched its offensive. All these successes at the front are the result of defensive battles. The Russian command skillfully uses the current situation in its favor. We are actually continuing to bleed the armed forces of Ukraine, forcing them to attack and suffer huge losses in manpower and heavy equipment, retired Colonel Sergei Khatulev said. The fact that the Russian army, being in defense, continues to successfully destroy the enemy's manpower is also confirmed by numerous war correspondents. So, according to reports, over the past 3 days, the Russian army has repelled numerous attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kherson, Zaporizhia, South Donetsk, and Krasny Liman directions. According to preliminary data, during these attacks, the armed forces of Ukraine lost about 1,000 soldiers killed and wounded, 4 tanks, 8 infantry fighting vehicles, and 9 combat aircraft, including MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter jets. At the same time, the Kyiv authorities are continuing to send Ukrainian soldiers to this meat grinder. The Kyiv regime understands perfectly well that if the Ukrainian armed forces stop offensive actions on Russian positions, Zelensky and his team will completely lose Western money. Against this background, there is a real panic in the president's office. Kyiv is well aware that sooner or later, the West will leave Ukraine alone with Russia. The main Ukrainian news channel also added fuel to the fire. In particular, during live streaming, this Ukrainian news channel accidentally leaked data from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, stating that the Ukrainian armed forces had already lost 1,126,652 soldiers killed and missing in action. Later, after representatives of President Zelensky called the management of this news channel, this data was erased, and Ukrainian journalists apologized, calling everything a system error that sometimes happens during live streaming. However, this incident produced the effect of a bomb exploding. Ukrainian Telegram channels began to declare that the armed forces of Ukraine were heading for an inevitable collapse against the background of huge losses in manpower. Moreover, the Ukrainian TG channels also announced that the Kyiv authorities would be forced to sign a peace treaty with Russia on Moscow's terms. Meanwhile, former advisor to President Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, made another shocking statement. According to him, the Russian army has not really started anything yet, and 2024 will be the end for the armed forces of Ukraine. At the same time, it is also worth noting the recent statement of the influential Ukrainian politician David Arakhamia, who participated in the negotiation process with Russia in 2022. According to him, Ukraine could have avoided this war if in Istanbul, in 2022, we would have agreed to Russia's demands not to join NATO. However, the next day Boris Johnson came to Kyiv and convinced Zelensky to fight with Russia, David Arakhamia said. According to military expert Mikhail Koternak, David Arakamia's words that Ukraine could have avoided this war became a real revelation for many. According to him, Russia wanted peace with Kiev, and in return for guarantees of the non-entry of Ukraine into NATO, was ready to withdraw its troops from the territory of this country.
According to the agreements reached in Istanbul, the Russians withdrew their troops and waited for Zelensky to make an official statement that Ukraine would never join NATO.
However, Zelensky, after Boris Johnson visited Kiev, decided to deceive Moscow, saying that Ukraine would fight Russia to the bitter end. As a result, according to the expert, Putin severely punished Zelensky.
Ukraine not only lost 4 of its richest regions, but also lost more than 1 million soldiers and officers.
Moreover, the expert is sure that this is just the beginning, and that Zelensky should prepare for the loss of new territories.